Hello, my name is Scott Chapman. I'm the CEO of Project Hosts, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar about HIPAA and HITRUST Azure Security Envelopes. I'd like to also let you know that with me on our team today is Avidan Antonier, who's our VP of BizDev, and Brian Farrell, who's our Healthcare Account Executive. So we want to talk today about security envelopes. That is what we call putting on top of Azure the security that is needed to be fully compliant with HIPAA and HITRUST. So I want to first talk a little bit about who we are, and then about HITRUST, then about thoughts about moving into the cloud, and then get into the details of what's required to put in place that security. Who are we? Well, Project Host, we are an Azure-based cloud service provider. We've been providing cloud services for over a decade, and our focus is on healthcare and government. And what we do is we implement security compliance above the Azure level. So we make sure that your applications that are in Azure are fully SaaS level security compliant. We also do that in addition to HIPAA and HITRUST. We do it for other standards like ISO 27001 and FedRAMP and DoD. We have a number of pre-approved software as a service solutions that are in our cloud that can be used by our healthcare and government customers, and we have a number of satisfied customers, including many in the Fortune 500. So that's who we are. So I want to talk a little bit about what is HITRUST, the HITRUST standard, and how does it differ from HIPAA. HITRUST is a new emerging compliance standard for healthcare organizations, and this is how it differs from HIPAA. HIPAA is really a self-certification standard. There is no official HIPAA certification that you can get from the Department of Health and Human Services. And if you want to have a HIPAA audit, what you have to do is an ISO or FedRAMP audit and include your HIPAA policies in it. So it's a sort of an indirect method. HIPAA is also becoming a bit outdated, and it's not very prescriptive as a standard. So HITRUST is this new emerging standard for healthcare organizations that has an official certification, and it's audited by certified HITRUST auditors. It's continually updated, and it's very prescriptive. So there's lots of controls. One example of the difference in how prescriptive HIPAA versus HITRUST is just take passwords. In HIPAA, the control is simply that you have to implement procedures for creating, changing, and safeguarding passwords. Well, there's a lot of leeway in that lots of different things could be done and still be compliant with HIPAA. In HITRUST, it's very prescriptive. There's a minimum length for password, complexity, password requirements, change requirements, expiration. There's very prescriptive requirements for HITRUST. And that's true of controls throughout the standard, comparing HIPAA and HITRUST. So when you've got a HITRUST official certification, then it makes it much more, companies are much more confident that the security that is in place really has those rigorous and prescriptive standards. It's not a self-certification with the more squishy, let's say, standards of HIPAA. And so that's why many payers and other covered entities are now beginning to require HITRUST for healthcare organizations. So that's the background on HITRUST if you're not already familiar with it. And then the question is, if you want to move into the cloud and you want to move into Azure, what security do you need to put in place to make sure that when you make that move, you still are HIPAA compliant and increasingly for many healthcare providers and payers also HITRUST compliant. So that's what we're talking about today. And I want to start off by letting you know about a document that Microsoft has put out that is a great resource with this regard. It's called A Practical Guide to Designing Secure Health Solutions Using Microsoft Azure, and the link is right there, bottom right of this slide. By the way, I want to mention that we will make these slides available to anyone who wants them. You just email us afterwards. But what does Azure cover versus what do you need to cover? So here, Azure is covering everything that's in purple, And then you need to put in place the blue things when you're putting in place security on top of Azure. So if you're using Azure Infrastructure as a Service with virtual machines, for example, it's covering the physical security and the host security, the underlying servers. The virtual machines on top of the hosts and everything else on top of that is your responsibility to put in place the security for. With Platform as a Service, Azure covers more, and you can see the various areas where it covers more. But I want to go into much more detail in this about what you need to put in place and the Azure tools that you can use to do that. So when I'm talking about implementing security above the Azure level, here are my top 14 areas to do that implementation. So I want to go through each of these and briefly talk about a little bit about each of them, mention the Azure tools that can be used for them, measure also the Microsoft products, and just some things to keep in mind for them. In access control, one of the first things is to make sure that if you're using, for example, virtual machines in Azure, that the virtual machines you have can only talk to other virtual machines that they're required to talk with. So if you have an application and it needs to talk with a database, it can only talk with that database. And it doesn't talk with other databases it doesn't need to. And so one way to do this within Azure is to isolate various sets of servers using Azure virtual networks. And I want to mention that in this presentation, wherever I put something in italics and in orange, that's an Azure feature that you could put in place to do these things. If I put in italics without orange, it's just it's a Microsoft feature or Microsoft product, not necessarily Azure specific. So when you put in these virtual networks, then you can use Azure Network Security Groups to put in place essentially firewall rule sets around each network. So you can say this server, this IP address can only talk with that server at that IP address and only over these ports. So this is a best practice to really isolate subnets in this way. And when you put those in place, it's good to make sure that they stay in place and you can monitor that they are in place and haven't been changed using Azure Automation. We also think that a best practice is when you're accessing your environments in general, limit the number of points where the environment can be accessed from the outside world or external networks. So it's good to have in place a DMZ that can be protected by a web application firewall and also by web application proxy servers and other mechanisms. When you're working on the servers, you need to often use remote desktop. And to be able to have remote desktop protocol go through your DMZ and tunnel through and go to your servers, it's good to put in place remote desktop gateways. So that's another subnet that we put in place for security standards. Then there's other things to have in place around your servers: Active Directory, scanners, monitors, configuration management, backup. These things around your applications and databases are what we call our security envelope. And so having that access control in place is very important. And then, of course, at the user level, restricting users to make sure that they can only access applications they need to using least privilege. The next thing is identity and authentication. And so for that, we've deployed Active Directory. I think that's a great way to do that. You can also use Azure Active Directory, and you, in fact, will be using that to access Azure in the first place. But you may want to join your Active Directory in Azure with your on-premise Active Directory domain. And later, when I talk about lift and shift migrations, this is something that we recommend doing. If you're doing that, then you can put in place an Azure VPN gateway to join those. You may also have some strategy where you want to use single sign-on into your domain, in which case you could have ADFS set up in your Azure environment and use that through the WAPs to set up single sign-on. Often, if you have sensitive materials, you might want to have multi-factor in place, and Azure multi-factor is something that can be used to ensure that you have that in place, connected through ADFS and giving that second factor for your users. So these are the various things that you can do with identity and authentication to set that up. Server lockdown, this is something that in on-premise you're already doing, I'm sure, and so it just also has to be done in the cloud. When we're doing server lockdown, we do it according to Center for Internet Security standards, using Active Directory GPOs to do that lockdown. Another thing that we think is important is to do executable whitelists. So on any server, just make sure that you understand for the applications or databases running on that server, what actual executables have to run. And then use AppLocker to only allow those to run. That way, you know, if, God forbid, a hacker got into your environment and wanted to put on some software and start running it, they would not be able to execute those executables they put on there because they're not on the whitelist. So server lockdown is the next area. For HIPAA and HITRUST, you need to have encryption in transit and at rest. So in transit, you need to make sure that you're not using SSL anymore, only using TLS 2.0 or higher, since you want to use the strong standards which have not been broken yet. For encryption at rest, there's a number of things you can do in Azure. You can do disk encryption with Azure Managed Disks or BitLocker, and that's a good starting point. A better thing to do is database encryption, where you can be using SQL Transparent Data Encryption or Azure SQL, and the best is if you're doing app-level encryption. So that's the next area. Finally, the next is vulnerability scanning and patching. I mean, you do not want to get caught with your pants down. And so for this, it's important to have in place scanning software that can scan for your operating systems, databases, and web applications. Make sure you have some centralized reporting and trend analysis for that. And so then when you find those vulnerabilities, you'll need to have something in place to keep track of them and to categorize them. Is this a vulnerability that can be fixed by a patch or an update? Can it be fixed by a configuration change or a GPO setting? Is it a false positive? Or is this something that you just have to accept the risk that it's there because any change you make would cause your application not to work? And so you have to keep track of all these. In FedRAMP, the place you keep track of them is called a POAM, a plan of actions and milestones, but you need to have something like that to keep track of them. And then patch and update regularly. You can use Windows Update, and when you're doing your patching, it's important to do things first in a test environment. So in Azure, test environments, what can you do? Well, there's some great options for test environments in Azure because you're in the cloud. You can have a persistent test environment for some applications where you go ahead and test changes to that, but a great feature in Azure is where you can clone your whole environment and do testing within that, testing upgrades and testing all kinds of things. When you do this cloning, then every virtual server that you have and you've cloned now has the same name and same IP address as the live servers that are you're still using in your environment. So you can't have that connected to the real world, otherwise there would be name and IP conflicts. So you have to isolate that. And so you can clone things and isolate them and then access those through remote desktop and do testing of your entire environment as it is. So that's another great thing. Just bringing it up for as long as you need it, then taking it back down again. Another one of the nice features of the cloud. When you're making these changes and updates, it's important to have a change management system, an inventory management system. You know, if you're doing this on premise, you have one in place, certainly, and this is just an example workflow of what's involved with change management. You need to test a change to see if it's going to have a security impact, you know, approve it, and then doing it for real, do it in a maintenance window. So it's good to have a change management system that has that kind of a workflow and requires authorization for any changes. Also something that is auditable to see who actually authorized the change and who actually made the change. Then with the change system, it's important to have an inventory management system so that you have somewhere, and this is this is a control required for HITRUST and also HIPAA. You need to make sure that you have recorded somewhere what are all the servers that you have in place, all the subnets, all the software, whatever inventory you have, past services. You have to have those recorded somewhere in a constantly updated inventory. But the best practice there is to be monitoring that inventory that you have in place against what is actually deployed live within Azure, and also against what you actually authorized in your change management system, so that you're constantly checking all three of those to make sure that they're consistent and you don't have something that is deployed but not authorized, or something you've recorded but not deployed, one way or the other. So that can be checked using Azure Automation. All of the servers obviously need to have anti-malware and intrusion detection on them, and I'm not going to spend much time on this because this is done very much on-premise. The one thing I'll say is that it's good to connect those in with a more general log correlation system so that all of your logs end up in one place. And for logging, a great thing to use is Azure Operational Insights. That's where you can put agents on all your servers and your past services and have those logs correlated centrally and be able to see what's going on. It's important not only to have alerts on those, but to regularly review those logs. And then when things come up, you'll have to have a plan for incident response. You should have well-defined teams for incident response, categories of kinds of incidents, and phases for the response. And to be in the best shape, you'll need to test that to make sure that if some real incident happened, you'd be good to go and you would have a quick and effective response. The next is backup and disaster recovery. So on the left here, I'm showing a security envelope with some maps and databases in it. And there's some primary storage there, and there's ongoing replication over into secondary storage in a secondary data center. That's in case the primary data center is destroyed for some reason. So that ongoing replication can happen using Azure geo-redundant storage. So for example, if your servers are using geo-redundant storage, then that replication happens automatically over to a secondary data center, Azure data center you've determined. Sometimes you'll want to use high-performance premium storage. It gives you faster performance for certain applications. And when you're doing that, the replication does not happen automatically, so you have to set up some sort of replication scheme to get over to your secondary data center. In addition to that, you should have just regular backups in place in case you have database corruption or accidental loss. But if there is a disaster, and Microsoft calls it disaster of the primary data center, then all that secondary storage becomes available in the second data center. And what you need to have in place are rebuild scripts that will rebuild all of your subnets, network security groups to protect them, virtual machines, everything from that storage in that secondary data center, and make sure that all gets rebuilt within the time frame that you need for your recovery. If you're using past services, a lot of this is just automatic, Azure SQL and Azure Cloud Services, for example. In another area that's important is cybersecurity training. So when you look at the causes of cybersecurity breaches, there's a significant number of them that are due to human error. In fact, even the other areas, system glitch or malicious attack, have often some human error involved with them. So it's really important that the people that are managing your system have been well trained in cybersecurity, not just generally, but also in implementing cybersecurity in Azure. And then my last of my 14 points is, no matter how good you are in terms of your cybersecurity, it's always good to get audited by a third party. And so what we do are annual audits for HITRUST, ISO 27001, where we throw in our HIPAA controls to ensure we're HIPAA compliant, and then FedRAMP and DoD. So those are my 14 points for how to secure environments on top of Azure. Okay, let's see. Let me just, okay, there we go. Now I'd like to talk about, once you've secured those environments, how can you optimize Azure performance, availability, and cost efficiency? I also want to talk about migrating into Azure. So the great thing about Azure in terms of optimizing performance is that if you've got bottlenecks on a server or in a service or something, you can scale up or scale out very easily. So you can just change that server to boot up on a bigger server with more RAM or more CPU, or you can scale out to have multiple servers doing the same job. And you can set up automatic scale-out schemes. For example, using Azure VM scale sets, you can set thresholds so that when you hit the threshold in CPU, RAM, or something like that, boom, another server is provisioned. Also, Cloud Services does a similar thing in the PaaS services area. And then in terms of availability, again, the cloud is great for this because you can set up Azure availability sets, and that load balances from one VM to another within a data center. So if a VM goes down, or if you need to bring it down in order to do updates on it, or Microsoft's doing updates on its underlying host, then things are still going strong with the other servers in that availability set. For databases, you can have clustering that is also complementing that. And then if you want to also have something that's better for disaster recovery for the whole data center going down, you can have SQL always on with a database server in a secondary data center. So it's being constantly updated. And if you did have a disaster, you're really losing no data when you go to that secondary data center. If you're using the PaaS services in Azure, then that just takes availability to the next level, and it's managed by Azure directly. So then, in terms of optimizing Azure cost efficiency, the great news with Azure is that you only pay for what you use. The bad news, and I'm not sure I should say this if there's Microsoft people, but Azure billing is difficult to understand. And so here's like a small excerpt of one of our Azure billing statements. That they have thousands of lines, and many of the lines are just for a few cents. And so it's difficult to really see what's going on when you have that much data unless you consolidate it in various ways so that you can see, oh, this is what's driving my cost. So for us, what we've done is we've developed a Power BI Azure Billing Consolidator that takes the billing from Azure and puts it into ways that's easier to understand, and so we can really see what's driving the cost so it can be optimized. And like I say, the great news is you only pay for what you use, and when you can see that in place, it's really effective. Next, I want to talk about migration into Azure. And every migration is a little bit different. So when on the next three slides, I'm going to talk about a three-phased approach, which is kind of general, but I think it gives a flavor for at a high level how we recommend migrating into Azure if you want to do, for example, a lift and shift migration. So when we're doing that, the first thing that we do is we want to have a domain controller in Azure that is a domain controller from your on-premise network. So to do that, we first set up either a VPN gateway with your on-premise network into Azure or an express route so that we can connect your on-premise Active Directory into Azure. Then once we've done that, we provision a domain controller there in your Azure subscription for your on-premise domain. Then what we do is we set up the rest of our security envelope. So put in the scanners, monitors, configuration management backup. We put in place the DMZ, the remote desktop gateway. We put in that whole security envelope. And we put in some, one sample application with no real data. But once we have that in place, what we do then is make sure that users can authenticate and access that sample application. So if they can do that, then that is half the battle. And the next phase is to do a test migration where we take one application on-premise, want to do a lift and shift. So to do that, we take exact copies of the servers themselves, including the server name, server IP address, everything. We also take exact copies of the on-premise Active Directory servers. You can use site recovery to do that. And then we bring them into Azure and we put them in isolation. They have to be in isolation in order to not have name or IP conflicts with the ones that are still live in your on-premise data center. When they're in isolation, we use remote desktop to access them, test for vulnerabilities and functionality, and see anything that we need to change in order to make it to work well. Then we go on to phase 3, which is we're doing that live. Same thing, we're bringing over the app and database server, but first we do it all in a maintenance window, and we shut down the ones on-premise, bring over the other ones. And so that's our 3-phase approach for bringing over, one application in a lift and shift, and then just doing it again and again for more applications. So let's say you want to deploy in Azure. What are your options? Well, all the things that I mentioned there, you can do it yourself. And so it might take a certain amount of time, especially if you want to get certified for HITRUST as well. It could be expensive. The other way is we can do it for you. So that's always an option. It's a quick option, and it's a lot less expensive, especially if you want to get the certification than doing it yourself. So what we offer is a turnkey solution. The security's in place. We have Azure experts. We allow you to avoid mountains of documentation required to prove your compliance with HITRUST if you're intending to do that, and avoid the learning curve as to what is acceptable to HITRUST auditors. So those are your options. If you deploy with us, I've showed you in one sense, what is our security envelope. This is another way to look at what we have in our security envelope. One is we bring in apps and workloads from various customers. The other is that we have some specific pre-approved ISV applications. And a couple of examples, we've got applications and backup and archiving. We've got applications that do portals and websites. The next page, I will show you, some logos of some applications that are already pre-approved to be in our HITRUST compliant environment and HIPAA compliant. In that same environment, we have other options where you can do disaster recovery as a service. If maybe you don't want to move everything into the cloud, just your disaster recovery into the cloud. So we can do that for you using approaches similar to what I mentioned in terms of the migration. So then we also have virtual desktop solutions, so that if you want to get away from having laptops that could get stolen and might have protected health information on them, and have just thin clients that have nothing on them, so if they get stolen, no big deal, and have people use virtual desktops, we have the ability to do that. So that's what we offer. Here's some logos of our pre-approved software vendors for our environment. And they've got lots of great applications for a lot of different things, and we can let you know more about it if you're interested in any of these. And we're bringing on new applications all the time. So if there are specific ones you're interested in, we can bring those on as well. I wanted to also mention that one of the big things for us is to make sure that we're compliant not only with HIPAA, but also with HITRUST. For us, we also have to be compliant with other things like FedRAMP and DoD and ISO 27001. And we developed this tool, a security compliance tool, which has all of the controls for a given standard. And then it has places where you can put in what are the things that are required for you to do, or what have you put in place in order to be in compliance with that control for that standard. And we've made that available to people for free for the HIPAA standard. So here's a screenshot of that tool. What this does is it allows you to say for each of the HIPAA controls, what is that HIPAA control and what have you put in place in order to ensure that you have compliance with it. You might want to also attach some evidence, like if you're going through an audit, an auditor will want to have screenshot evidence that you have various things in place. And so that can be attached into the tool. When we go through audits, for example, when we went through our HITRUST audit, our auditors were saying that we were one of the best prepared companies that they've ever run into. And so the audit was very smooth, and a big reason for it is because of this compliance tool. So I wanted to let you know that that's something free. If you would like to be able to use that, the HIPAA version of it, then we'd be happy to provide you with access. That's it for the main part of the presentation. I did in 30 minutes, so I would leave 15 minutes for questions. I want to let you know that if you're interested in a copy of this slide deck, please email Brian. His email is right there, and he can also provide you with access to our ISMS tool for HIPAA. So I'd like to go ahead and see if there are any questions. Oops, let me go back. Okay. Eris, by the way, our VP of Biz Dev, is holding his computer here to let me know if there are questions coming up. Okay. Do we have one here? Yeah. Whoops. Let me go back here. So one question that we often get a lot of is, what is it when you're doing a HITRUST audit? How long does it take not only to do the audit, but how long does it take to prepare for it, to put things in place? What's the overall cost? And we found that preparation, it's often good to hire a consultant to help you get in place your answers for that. Preparation and everything can be 6 months or more. And the audit itself is a couple weeks, and then after you've done that, then it's a couple months before you get your certification. So
there is a question about Azure subscription, if they can keep their own, and what happens in such a case.
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, can you keep your own Azure subscription? And the answer is yes. So let me go back to show the security envelope, what that looks like. I'm just going to go through a few slides here. So we put in place a security envelope in your Azure subscription. So we'll put in place the DMZ, remote desktop gateways, all these various things in it in order to bring your applications in. So yes, you can keep your subscription, and what we do is in our updated audits from HITRUST, then we just include that, your subscription, in our boundary for our next HITRUST audit. So that's how that works. But the way that we know that it's fine is because what we put in place for your subscription is exactly the same as what we put in place has been approved by HITRUST. And so we can add more of these and add them into our boundary.
Can they leverage the ISMS cloud in that perspective?
Yes. So the question is, can they leverage the ISMS cloud? Yes. In your own environment like this, then you can have a copy of the ISMS cloud that can show you what controls are in place and how that's done for your environment. And that's both for HIPAA and for HITRUST, we can't make that free to you because you need to actually buy the HITRUST standard. But if you buy the HITRUST standard, that can also be put in place for you for the ISMS cloud for that environment.
Okay. How can they get a copy of the presentation?
A copy of the presentation you can get by emailing Brian, and let me go back to that page. So there we go, brian.farrell, 2 R's, 2 L's, at projecthosts, with an S on the end, .com. So if you email Brian, he'd be happy to send you a copy of the presentation. He can also provide you with access to the ISMS cloud. Okay, no more questions?
No.
Well, hey, thank you all for coming to this presentation. I hope that it was helpful. And please reach out to Brian or any of us if you have any questions. We'd be very happy to help. Thank you very much.